Shalom, this is Levi Shore. Welcome back to Swing Good Torah. We have an amazing Parsha today, Lech Lecha. It's all about Avraham, about Abraham, or as he's known in the Parsha, Avraham, before he gets the name change. There's a fascinating concept in the Torah called Maisa Avos Siman Labanim. So the actions of the Avos, the actions of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, the actions of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what they did in their lives, what the Torah tells us they did, it's a sign, it's a siman, for the bonding for the children, for the Jewish people throughout all of history. So what the Avos did in their lifetime, it gives us clues and hints of what's going to happen and unfold in Jewish history. So we're going to establish today, we're going to look into the Parsha, we're going to talk a lot about this war between the 4 and 5 kings, and we're going to see some amazing parallels maybe starting to take shape in current events and news, that's happening right now. So I don't know if we have exact detail of everything that's going to happen, but there's definitely some interesting parallels that we can start to look at. So first we got to really establish what happened, what happened back then in the Torah is like 4,000 years ago. So we can see some miraculous things. So first thing, in the Hebrew calendar, that's counted from, the creation of Adam Arishon, the creation of everything. So Avraham, or Avram, as he's called in the Parsha, is known as Abraham throughout the world. He was born in 1948. And right away we see this amazing parallel because in 1948 of the Roman calendar, which really corresponds exactly to the Gullus Edom, we can talk about that another time, it's pretty fascinating. So 1948 we see the founding of the state of Israel. So right away we start to see these parallels. The flood of Noah was in 1656. And right away we see in 1656 of our calendar, or the Roman exile, we see that Baruch Spinoza was put into Cherem, and the flood of the Enlightenment begins to engulf and overcome the Jewish people. So then, 1996, in the Hebrew calendar, is the Tower of Babel, the Migdal Babel, the Tower of Babel. And at that time, after the flood, this man named Nimrod, who was a descendant of Ham, one of the 3 sons of Noah, the father of the African nations. And Nimrod becomes the king. He starts the first empire of the world. And he uses everyone's fear of the flood, and he gathers them all together to revolt against Hashem. And they build this tower. They were supposed to build a city and a tower, but they only built a tower. And that happens in 1996. And we see a fascinating parallel that in 1996 of our days, it was when the internet was really publicly released. So here, Hashem confuses and separates all the nations with all these languages. And maybe 1996 is the beginning of some kind of tikkun for all this, where now all the people, the nations of the world can be brought together on this World Wide Web, this internet. So that's fascinating. Okay, so when our Parsha starts, we have some important dates here. So we're going to see this war of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. Now there was the 4 kings. There was this king named Chedorla Omer. Doesn't roll off the tongue exactly. And he was the king of Elam, I think, and he was descended from Shem. So it's another son of Noah, and from Shem comes is where Avraham is descended from too. So he subjugates these other 5 kings, and that started in 2009, and then they begin to revolt against him, and for 13 years until 2022, and then in 2023 this great war breaks out. So so it's fascinating here because we see after Hashem, the Dora Flaga, after Hashem begins to separate all the nations and separates and creates these 70 languages, because everyone before spoke Lashon HaKodesh, they spoke the Hebrew language of the Torah, the language that everything was created with. So after the separation, we see a different world now. We see a world where Nimrod is no longer this all-powerful like emperor of an empire, king of an empire. And now this other king, Chedorla Omer, he's now the more prominent king, and he's really the leader of these 4 kings. And then we see them against these other 5 kings. So these other 5 kings were the Canaani, the Canaanite kings who lived in Eretz Yisrael. And the Torah tells us they lived around the Yam HaMelach, the Salt Sea, which is the Dead Sea today, and and I think it's called the Sadeh Shidim. It's called the Valley of the Shidim, Valley of the Fields, but it's an unusual term because literally Sados, not Sidim, would be used for fields. So that there's very mystical and important secrets in there. We're not going to go into everything. There's so much information to get to. But we see a split. So the interesting thing is all these kings, all these nations were all united at one time under Nimrod, and now they're all fighting each other. But what are they fighting each other for? They're just fighting each other for domination of the world, and they're all really opposed to Hashem. And only Avram is the one who's teaching and creating students with Sarah, his wife, and teaching about Hashem. And Avram even figured out the Torah before it was given at Mount Sinai. So it's fascinating. There was a Masorah from Adam Arishon all the way to Noach, and Noach all the way, until until here. And there was people that did know. The people mentioned in the Torah, there's 10 generations from Adam to Noach, and from Noach to Avraham. These 20 generations are the ones mentioned, are the ones that had the Masorah, the ones that did know the Torah, even before the Torah was officially given to mankind. So there's only 7 mitzvahs given to the children of Noach. So they fought this war. So they initially invaded. So these 4 kings led by Chedar Omer. And Chedar Omer, he subjected other people to his rule. And then they were revolting against him. So he was taxing them, and they were revolting against him. And these other 4 kings were his allies. So let's go through a little bit of these kings first. So there was Chedar Omer, who most of the Meforshim considered to be, I think, I guess Persia. They consider it Persia maybe, or Greece. I'm not sure. But then there was this other king named Tidal Goyim, who was Tidal, and he was the king of the nations. He was the Melech Goyim. Goyim means nations. So he ruled also over many nations, and that represents Edom. That represents the future Roman Empire. Maybe Chedar Omer represents maybe the Persian Empire. So Amraphel, who is Nimrod, he's now called Amraphel because he threw Avraham into the Or Kasdim. He threw Avraham into the fire when he wouldn't bow down to him, or bow down to the Avodah Zarah, to the idols, or destroy the idols. So Amraphel is now Nimrod, and he ruled in Bavel, which is modern day Iraq. And then Arioch Elasar, who may be Greece, he was the 4th king. So these kings were all allies of Chedar Omer, and it's fascinating because Nimrod is no longer the head king, and these others are his allies. But he's really the leader. He's the one that we see him. He starts attacking other places. It tells us that, first they invade. So the war is going to happen into the Emek Hasidim, the valley of the fields, and he has his allies with him. And we see that Chedar Omer, we're told that he invaded like the Rephaim and Astaros Karnaim. He attacked the Zuzim in Ham, the Amim in Shaveh Kiryasayim, and he attacked the Chori in the mountains of Seir, and that's going to be a reference where Esav, when he's born, who founds Edom, who founds Rome, that he's going to conquer the Chori, the Chorim, and they're going to marry with each other, and it's going to form Edom. And then we see that Chedar Omer, he also attacks Paran, which is a reference to the future descendants of Yishmael, the Arab countries. So we see that this Chedar Omer, he's the aggressor, and he's attacking, and then he's going to invade the 5 kings. So who are the 5 kings? So the 5 kings were around the area that the Dead Sea is today. But it was fascinating because back in those days, it was called the Parsha calls it the Gan Hashem, the Garden of Hashem, and it was beautiful with clear waters and lush grass and abundant crops and abundant areas to raise animals. And it's not what it looks like today. Because in the Parsha, we see a separation we see fights between the shepherds of Lot and Avraham. Lot is he's the nephew of Abraham, of Avraham. And they're shepherds because of the wealth they're both acquiring. They begin to fight with each other. And Lot separates to the east, and Avraham goes to the west. And Lot chooses to live in the famous or infamous cities of Sodom, and Gomorrah, or the Torah calls them Sodom and Amorah. And there was 5 great cities. There's 5 huge metropolises, and at the time it was this lush area, and there was extreme wealth, and that's what some of the reason led to these people's wickedness. There was this abundance. The land was green and fertile, and it was great wealth, and 5 major cities were there. So the 4 kings are going to come in, and Chedar Omer was trying to subjugate these kings, and he was coming in to get the wealth, and and everything. So Og, the giant, he comes and warns Avraham that Lot was captured, and then Avraham takes his students, his 318 students, I think, and he gets involved in the war. So the four kings are more powerful, and they attack and defeat these 5 kings and take them capture. So the kings of Sodom and Amorah and the other cities, and none of these people were righteous. This is not a battle of good and evil. This is a battle of evil and evil. They're all against Hashem, and it's all about a domination and who would just be more powerful and rule the other nations. And there is another fascinating thing. So during this war, the king of Sodom, he falls into a pit of what the Torah calls chemer. Let me see if I can find it real quick. He falls into a be'eros chemar. So it's a pit of bitumen. So what's bitumen? Bitumen is petroleum. It's either can be in a liquid or a semi-fluid state, and it's petroleum. And the Greeks called it aphalstos, which is asphalt, and it's what's made the roads, and it's petroleum. So it's going to be fascinating. It's a little interesting thing as we're going to start to turn and look at current events. So that's what happened. Hashem gave Avraham a miraculous victory over the 4 kings who defeated the 5 kings, and he freed Lot, and he frees the king of Sodom and Amorah and their allies. And and let me quickly go through everyone's name, and then we'll try to see if we can get some glimpses into current events, which it's fascinating because there is a lot of parallels here. So the 5 kings, the 5 Canaanite kings who lived around what's now the Dead Sea, but back when it was rich and luscious, and they were very wealthy, these 5 metropolises. So there was Bera. He was the king of Sodom, and his name, the Bays, is the gematria of 2, and Ra. So it's 2 ways he was evil. So he's not a good guy. The king of Sodom, infamous for its evil, and we're going to see a lot more of that in their destruction next Parsha. So then there's Birsha. Once again, the Bays, the 2, the Risha, 2 ways in his wickedness. And the next king, and he was the king of Risha was the king of Amorah, which is called Gomorrah. Then Shinav, and this one's really fascinating because the Rashi says that Sonei Aviv Sheba Shemayim, that he hated his father in heaven, he hated Hashem, and he was the king of the next city of Admah, and then there's Shem Aver, and this one is really fascinating what the Midrash says here, and he was the king of Savoyim, and it says in some Midrashim that he was called Shem Aver because he Sam Aver, he put an artificial limb on himself, La'of, to fly. He invented some kind of flying device, some kind of wings to jump up in the air. And then in his technology, he was using Limrod b'Hakadosh Baruch Hu, to rebel against the Holy One, blessed be He. So some kind of flying technology here. Very fascinating, 4,000 years ago. And then Bela is just the city, the king of Bela, the city. So this king is maybe not as wicked as the other 4, and his name is not expressly mentioned, just his city, and the city is also called Soar. And we'll see in the destruction of these 5 cities in next week's Parsha that Soar was a younger city, so their wickedness had not come up to the level of the other 4. So that king, his name is not mentioned, so he's not as wicked as the other 4. But these 5 kings were defeated by the 4 kings, and then they fall into and the king of Sodom falls into some kind of petroleum pit, and he's rescued, and they're all rescued, and there's a miraculous victory that Avraham has and defeats the 4 kings. Okay, so the war ended. The war ended. So this war happened in Eretz Israel. It happened in the land of Israel. But Avraham chases the 4 kings up, and the war ends. The pasuk says, "Mismol Damasek," from the left of Damascus in Syria, so some of the translations to the north of Syria, to the left of Syria. So we see this great war in Eretz Israel. We see the conclusion of it happening in Syria. And it seems like this could give us some insight to all the current events that we're watching right now, because we see all these nations of the world gathered in Syria. So just in modern times, Syria was engaged in a civil war, and then Russia and Iran come in and give them support and prop up Assad, the ruler of Syria. And then Iraq also, the government of Iraq has also given financial support and allowed their airspace to Iran to fly weapons and supplies into Syria. So we see maybe a modern parallel between the four kings. And if I had to guess, Chadar LaOmer, there's some unfortunately that say different, but to me, Chadar LaOmer would be Persia, would be Iran, because we see that Chadar LaOmer back in the Torah is the aggressor. He's the one that's uniting everyone. He's the one that's subjugating other nations. And it's fascinating because we see like Iran controls proxies. Iran controls Hezbollah. They control Hamas, Islamic Jihad in Gaza, both of those in Gaza. They control their proxies in Yemen. And Iran is the aggressor here. Iran is the one that attacks American drones. They've attacked, or captured the British tanker. They attacked the Saudi Arabian oil field. So we see that they're the aggressor right now in the region. And they're the ones that maybe are going to move the events forward. So I definitely look to Iran as the one that's pushing, this world to the brink of this massive world war right now. So Tidal Goyim, the king of nations, I would say that would relate to Edom, but in this case, I think it would be Russia. And we see that during the days of the Soviet Union, like Russia, the Soviet Union controlled many other nations. They controlled all of Eastern European nations. They controlled Ukraine, they controlled Czechoslovakia, they control Lithuania, Poland, like many other nations they control. Like even nations like Kazakhstan. So the Soviet Union, many nations they controlled, and even today we still see Russia under Putin that they've gone into and taken over some of Georgia, taken over some of Ukraine, and they're in Syria, and and there's a little tension between them and Turkey. So I'd say it's Iran, Russia, Amraphel. I think it's easier. It's Nimrod, who's Bavel, which is Iraq. And what's fascinating is at first Nimrod was the power of the region. And we saw that with Iraq, where Saddam Hussein was the true power of the nation. And then after the fall of Saddam Hussein, Iran becomes the power of the nation. They become the one. And then Arioch is maybe related to Greece and Syria. So Syria is related to Greece. And that's a little bit of a stretch there. But it's fascinating because under Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire did conquer Syria. They ruled Syria. And there's the famous story of Hanukkah and Antiochus, who was the Greek king. He ruled Syria. His territory was around Syria. So there may be some relationship between Syria and Greece. So these are the four modern day allies. I don't know. I mean, Hezbollah would also be around this conflict, but I don't know how they would fit into it. So I don't have the details clearly, but we just see there's some interesting parallels here. So the Kanani, now this is a little trickier because obviously, like the Dead Sea, there's not much living around the Dead Sea. There's not Kanani kings around the Dead Sea. Even you want to say like the Kanani, there were seven groups of the Canaanites. There's seven Palestinian terrorist organizations. So there's definitely some connection there between the seven modern day Palestinians, the Palestine, and the seven Kanani, the Canaanites. But I would have to say for these four Kanani kings, or I'm not exactly sure, but I would say that maybe the relationship in the modern world we're viewing is more related to Yishmael. And I would say what we're really seeing is the four kings in the modern day conflict would be the four Shiite powers, even though Russia is not really like Shia, but they're allied. They're allied, just as like, maybe Tidal Goyim, didn't have the same, beliefs as Chadar LaOmer, but they were kind of following Chadar LaOmer. In this case, Iran, even though Russia is probably much more powerful, but so too then. The title Goyim was a king that ruled over many nations, so very powerful. So we see like the lessening of Iraq, the ascension of Iran, and that's just Amraphel, Nimrod falls in power and Chadar LaOmer rises, and we see that the diminishing of Iraq, the rising of Iran. So the Kanani, I would say, I'm not exactly sure, but if I had to say there's five Sunni powers, I would say something like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, the Kurds, and Turkey. And they're all there. And they are somewhat aligned. And I think the conflict is really, as it's interesting that the Beiros Khemar, the falling into the pits of the petroleum, and it's fascinating because we're talking about petroleum, and for sure that's what this Sunni Shiite conflict is about. They're fighting over oil pipelines. Do pipelines come from Saudi Arabia and Qatar through Syria, through Turkey into Europe, or are they coming down from Russia into Iran and through Iran, into Syria and then to Europe. So we're fighting about oil pipelines here. Now, so the U.S., the U.K., and France, these are major Western powers, and you would think they would be heavily involved. But I think until recently, when we see President Trump pull the U.S. back, so that's really fascinating. So we see a pull back of the U.S., which I think will also pull back the U.K. and France. So it may lessen their involvement, and it may increase the involvement, of this 4 against 5, the Shia versus Sunni. So there's some fascinating parallels here. Petroleum is referenced in the Parsha, and I don't know the exact details, but there is definitely something very interesting here. Now then, Lot. So who's Lot's descendants? So Lot's descendants is Moab and Ammon. And his descendants were the only ones that were not by the Assyrian king Sancherib. Like Sancherib, he shuffled many of the nations. He would pull a nation out of one country, put it in another country, and the 70 nations of the sons of Noah were shuffled, except for the nations of Ammon and Moab, modern-day Jordan. So fascinating. So the capture of Lot. So somehow this conflict of the Sunni and the Shia could pull Lot or pull Jordan, who has a peace treaty right now with Israel. And even though, they're not the best of friends, but there is some cooperation between Israel. And then Avraham and his descendants is obviously Israel. And then Lot maybe pulling Israel in between, in the middle of this massive conflict. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen. But this is extremely fascinating, this war of the 4 and 5 kings. And I think we see it starting to take shape in our days. And who knows? And I said before that the Bris Bein HaBesarim happened in 2018. I didn't realize it was a Machlokas. So there was some people, and there's different sources like Midrash Rabbah for Breshis Rabbah and Seder Olam and other books dealing with the chronology of the Torah. So I didn't realize there's a Machlokas, and some people say that the Bris Bein HaBesarim, that after this war happened in 2023, coming up, not 2018 maybe, because all we saw in 2018 was that President Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. So a significant event, recognizing the Golan Heights, significant event, and that recognition of the Golan Heights may lead to this further tension that maybe starts to pull in Jordan and Israel, and how that all works out, if this is really this pattern, if this is the pattern of something happening. But 2023 is when, Avraham defeated the 4 and the 5 kings, and we're not so far away from 2023, and we see all these nations swirling around Syria, and it is fascinating. So the defeat, when Avraham defeats this, he makes the bris, he makes the covenant between Hashem and the Jewish people, and then 2023 is when Avraham, when this is done, he settles in the land of Israel, and this could be Moshiach. We could be heading, 2023 could be the case. I don't know. We're not supposed to predict it, but it is fascinating. We're getting close, and maybe we're looking at Moshiach soon and the ingathering of all the Jewish people. And B'ezrat Hashem, may it happen quickly in our days. Who knows? Maybe it can happen quicker. Achi Shena, let's speed it up. But we're heading into fascinating times, and let's dig in deep. Let's learn the Torah, the simchas of the Torah, the simchas of the mitzvahs. Let's be kind to each other. Let's start that achdus of Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, and may we see amazing Yeshuos and Hashem shav rachamim, mercy and compassion on us all. May we see amazing times, and I hope to see you back again soon on Sweet and Good Torah.